I never thought the woman who called me mom would humiliate me in front of 200 people with a glass of champagne I paid for. It happened on the day I thought I was gaining a daughter. The music was soft, the lights golden, and as I lifted my glass to toast the happy couple, my daughter-in-law Amber smiled that perfect practiced smile and tipped her drink right over my head. The crowd gasped, then laughed. My son Ethan froze. I just stood there, champagne dripping down my face, my heart breaking in silence. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I memorized her smile, because what Amber didn't know was that she had just toasted her own downfall. A year later, I walked into their anniversary party with a secret of my own, a truth she thought she'd buried long ago. When I took the microphone that night, the laughter stopped, the lights dimmed, and every lie she'd ever told came to life on the screen behind her. She tried to run, but it was already too late. Keep listening, because this story doesn't end with champagne. It ends with justice. My name is Margaret Hall, and I'm 63 years old. I've been a widow for almost 9 years now. Before retirement, I worked as a librarian at the community college in our small Pennsylvania town. I live in the same white house my husband Robert and I bought in 1985, the one with the rose garden he planted out front. These days, the roses keep me company. They bloom faithfully each spring, even when the winters feel longer than they should. I was pruning them the morning my son Ethan came home with that look in his eyes, the kind of look men get when they've already made a decision, and they're hoping you'll agree. He's 32 now, still the polite, soft-spoken boy who used to help me carry boxes of books when he was little. But that morning, there was something restless about him. He kept brushing his hand through his hair, pacing the porch like he was trying to find the right words. "Mom," he finally said, "I have something to tell you. It's good news." I smiled, expecting maybe a job promotion, or that he'd decided to move back home for a while. He's an architect in Philadelphia, always busy, always working late. But then he said it. "I'm getting married." For a moment, I just stared at him. I could hear the hum of the lawnmower down the street, the wind brushing through the rose bushes. Married. It shouldn't have surprised me. He's handsome, kind, and single, but something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten. "That's wonderful," I said, forcing the words through a throat that suddenly felt too dry. "To who?" He showed me a picture on his phone. Her name was Amber. She had long blonde hair, eyes like ice, and a smile that was so perfect it almost didn't look real. Everything about her was polished, her posture, her makeup, even the way she tilted her head toward Ethan in the photo, as if she'd rehearsed that exact angle 100 times. "She's amazing, Mom," he said, his voice lighting up. "Smart, funny, beautiful. You'll love her." I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it, or at least I wanted to. But after he left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at that photo on my phone. Something about her smile lingered with me. I've always believed that a person's eyes tell you who they are. Hers told me nothing. They were too still. I tried to shake it off. It wasn't fair to judge a woman I hadn't met. Robert used to say I could read too much into things, that I found meaning in the smallest shadows. "Not every cloud is a storm, Maggie," he'd say, with that teasing half grin of his. I could almost hear his voice saying it now. So I baked a pie that evening, because that's what I do when I need to quiet my mind. The kitchen smelled like apples and cinnamon, and for a little while, I could almost believe everything was fine. Ethan called after dinner, his voice bubbling with excitement, telling me how he'd proposed, how she'd cried, how her family was thrilled. "Mom," he said, "I really want you to meet her. She's been nervous about it, but I told her you'd love her." "Nervous?" I asked. "Why?" He hesitated. "She said mothers can be protective of their sons. She just doesn't want to make a bad first impression." I laughed softly. but something about that answer stuck with me. How could someone be worried about making a bad impression before even meeting me? It felt rehearsed, as if she'd studied every move before stepping into my life. That night after he hung up, I walked out to the garden with a cup of tea. The air was cool and smelled of damp soil. I thought about how proud Robert would have been his son getting married, building a life. That's all any parent wants, isn't it? For their children to be happy. Still, I couldn't ignore the small flicker of unease that had settled in my chest. I looked up at the stars and whispered, "If my son's happy, that's all that matters." But even as I said it, I felt something inside me tighten, as if those words were too simple to be true. Because sometimes happiness blinds us, and sometimes what we call love is just a mask, one that only slips when it's too late to stop the damage. And as I walked back inside, the quiet house felt colder than usual, though I didn't yet know why. I only knew that life had shifted slightly in that imperceptible way it does before a storm. I said those words with love, and they'd come back to haunt me. It was 2 weeks later when Ethan called to tell me Amber wanted to visit. I remember the way he said it, like he was trying to sound casual but was really checking my temperature before bringing her home. "She's nervous, Mom," he said over the phone. "She really wants you to like her." I told him as warmly as I could that I already did. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to be the kind of mother who welcomed change, who didn't make her son choose between old love and new. In truth, I was more anxious than I wanted to admit. I'd cleaned the house twice, polished the silver, baked a lemon loaf, Robert's favorite. Not because Amber would care, but because it made the place smell like comfort. I even trimmed the roses again, just enough to fill a vase. When I caught myself fussing over which teacups to use, I laughed softly and shook my head. 63 years old and still nervous about making a good impression. When they arrived, Ethan's car pulled into the driveway, music playing too loud. He jumped out first, all energy and grins, the way sons do when they're proud of something. Amber stepped out slower, one polished leg at a time. She was striking tall, slim hair the color of honey in sunlight. Everything about her was deliberate, the way she smoothed her dress, the way her sunglasses stayed on just a second longer than necessary. "Mrs. Hall," she said brightly, extending her hand. "Finally, I get to meet you." "Please," I said, taking her hand. "Call me Margaret." She gave a soft laugh. "Margaret it is. What a charming little house you have. It's so quaint." It was the way she paused before quaint that did it. A hesitation so slight most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did. She didn't mean it unkindly, perhaps, but there was something in the way she looked around that told me she wasn't used to small spaces or things that weren't brand new. Still, I smiled, ushered them inside, and offered tea. Amber moved through the living room with a kind of casual curiosity, touching the framed photos, glancing at the lace curtains. "You must have such an eye for nostalgia," she said, running her fingers along a shelf of books. "It's like stepping back in time." Ethan chuckled. "Mom's kept this place the same since Dad." He stopped himself, glanced at me. I nodded gently. "Since your father passed?" "Yes, I suppose I have." Amber turned toward the coffee table where I'd lit a candle rose, scented the same kind Robert used to like. She leaned closer, sniffed, then wrinkled her nose slightly. "Oh, this scent. It smells just like my grandma's closet." There was a beat of silence. I smiled and said lightly, "Then your grandma must have had excellent taste." Ethan laughed a soft burst of genuine amusement. Amber froze for half a second before smiling back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well," she said, straightening up, "I guess it's a classic." We sat down for tea. She complimented the lemon loaf, said the word lovely 3 times in the span of 2 sentences, and laughed a little too brightly at everything Ethan said. She was polite, poised, But there was a strange formality between us, as if she were performing kindness rather than offering it. So she began stirring her tea, though she hadn't added sugar. "Ethan tells me you've been helping with the wedding plans." "That's so generous of you." "Oh, I'm just happy to contribute," I said. She leaned forward slightly. "Well, I like to keep things organized. I thought maybe we could go over the budget together sometime. You know, to make sure we're not overspending in the wrong places." It was phrased as a suggestion, but the tone wasn't one. There was control in it, subtle and deliberate. I sipped my tea before answering. "Of course," I said evenly. "I trust you'll make it beautiful." "Beautiful, yes," she said with a little tilt of her head. "But tasteful, too. Sometimes people go overboard trying to make things sentimental." Her eyes flicked toward the framed photo of Robert on the mantel. Just for a second, but I saw it. Ethan, bless him, didn't notice. He was too busy talking about the venue, about catering, about how lucky he felt. He looked happy, radiantly, blindly happy. And I thought if she really loves him, maybe that's all that matters. Still, as she spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that every word she said was chosen the way a lawyer chooses clauses in a contract. There was nothing spontaneous, nothing vulnerable, only precision. When they finally stood to leave, she turned to me, her expression perfectly polite. "It was so nice to finally meet you, Margaret. I can see where Ethan gets his sweetness." "That's kind of you," I said, smiling back. But as she stepped out the door, sunlight catching on her hair, I noticed again what I'd seen in that photograph, the stillness in her eyes, the way her mouth smiled, but her gaze did not. It wasn't cold exactly. It was calculated, like a curtain drawn halfway shut. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that hides teeth. That was the last image of her I carried that night, the smile that felt more like a warning than a greeting. After that first visit, I told myself it had just been nerves. Maybe Amber had been trying too hard to impress, or maybe I was reading too much into it, as Robert always said I did. But the uneasy feeling stayed hovering in the back of my mind, like a draft that won't let a room warm. A few weeks later, the wedding planning began in earnest. I had thought I would simply write a check, show up on the day, and watch my son start his new life. Instead, I found myself pulled into a current I couldn't seem to swim against. Amber called almost every day, her voice sweet but insistent. "Margaret." I've been thinking she'd begin, and by the time she finished that sentence, it always meant spending more money. At first, the changes were small. She wanted gold cutlery instead of silver. "It'll photograph better," she said, as if the entire wedding existed for the camera's sake. Then it was a live band, not a playlist. Then a floral arch worthy of Ethan's mother's garden, she said, laughing like it was a compliment. Every suggestion came wrapped in flattery tied with a bow. "It's your big day too, Margaret. You're the one everyone will be looking at, the beautiful mother of the groom." Each time I nodded, smiled, and signed another check. It's strange how easily generosity can turn into guilt. The more she thanked me, the more obligated I felt to keep saying yes. I told myself it was all for Ethan, that he deserved a perfect day, that this was what a good mother did. But somewhere deep down, I knew Amber wasn't just planning a wedding. She was building a stage, and she was the only one meant to stand in the spotlight. Ethan didn't notice the shift. He was caught up in love, and love, I suppose, makes even the sharpest eyes soft. He'd show up at my house every Sunday, his face glowing with excitement, talking about flowers, colors, venues. Amber usually called during those visits, her voice coming through the speaker like a director giving instructions to an actor. "Don't forget to tell Mom about the new centerpiece idea," she'd say. "We want everything to feel cohesive." One afternoon, she stopped by alone, her heels clicking against the hardwood like tiny declarations. She carried a binder tabs, receipts, fabric swatches. I admired her organization at first. It reminded me of how I used to catalog books at the library. But then I noticed how every decision had already been made. She wasn't asking for opinions. She was informing me of outcomes. "Here's the seating chart," she said, spreading papers across my dining table. "I moved you to the left side next to Ethan's college friends. The right side's for my family. It just balances better visually." "Of course," I said, though my throat tightened. "Whatever works best." She smiled, tilting her head. "You're being such a team player, Margaret. Really, you're making this easy." When she left the house, felt heavier. Her perfume lingered in the air, sweet but sharp, like overripe fruit. I sat at the table long after she was gone, staring at the papers she'd left behind. My name, my role, my contribution. Everything had been neatly placed, just like her plans. I was no longer the mother of the groom. I was the financier of a performance. A week later, Ethan sent me a link to Amber's latest social media post. There she was, sitting beside me at the bakery during a cake tasting I hadn't realized was being filmed. The caption read, "Mother-in-law and I planning together. Family isn't about blood, it's about connection." The photo looked perfect, our heads tilted together, both of us smiling. What the picture didn't show was that she'd asked the baker to move the sample tray 3 times because lighting matters, or that my hand resting near hers in the frame had been trembling from exhaustion. The comments rolled in hundreds of them. "So lucky to have such a wonderful ML. You two look like best friends." I wanted to be happy reading them, but all I felt was a quiet kind of grief. The world was falling in love with an image, a version of us that only existed on her phone screen. Ethan called that evening, his voice light. "Everyone loves that picture, Mom. Isn't Amber amazing? She really makes people feel connected." "Yes," I said softly, watching the post glow on my own phone. "She's very good at that." After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The house was the same, but it no longer felt like mine. Somewhere between the gold cutlery and the filtered photographs, I'd started to disappear. I told myself it was temporary, that after the wedding things would settle, that I'd find my place again in Ethan's life. But as the weeks passed, the wedding grew larger, the smiles grew tighter, and Amber's shadow stretched a little further into everything that used to belong to me. The invitations went out, the deposits cleared, the plans were set in stone. On paper, it looked perfect, flawless even. And online, we looked like a family united by love. The world thought we were close, only I knew we weren't. That illusion was easier to keep online than it was in person. In photos, we looked like a perfect family, 2 generations smiling across teacups and flower arrangements. But in real life, there was always a thin film of tension between us, invisible to others, heavy to me. By the time the rehearsal dinner came around, that tension had hardened into something sharp. The dinner was held at a restaurant Amber chose, a new, sleek place in the city, all marble and candlelight and polished surfaces that looked too smooth to belong to real people. It wasn't what I would have picked. I had offered to host the meal at my house with homemade food and a garden view, something warm and personal. But Amber insisted on this. "Ethan and I want it to feel modern," she said. "Not like one of those church potlucks." I remember how she said it lightly, like a joke, but it cut all the same. The menu I'd suggested, the one she was teasing, was Robert's favorite baked chicken green beans with almonds, cornbread, apple pie. Simple, yes, but filled with memory. Ethan gave a small, nervous laugh. I could see him trying to smooth things over before they even began. "Come on, Amber," he said. "Mom's cooking is classic." She tilted her head, smiling at me. "Of course it is," she said sweetly. "Tradition is lovely. I just think this night should represent the future." I took a slow sip of water, feeling the eyes of the table turn toward me. "Tradition doesn't expire, dear," I said gently. "It just adds depth to the future." For a moment, there was silence. Amber held my gaze longer than necessary, her smile never faltering, but her eyes flashing with something colder, like glass catching light. Then she laughed, light and tinkling. "You're absolutely right, Margaret," she said. "I'll drink to that." She raised her glass and everyone followed. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice carrying just enough for the whole room to hear, and letting go of the old. There was polite laughter clinking glasses. I smiled, though it felt forced, and looked around at the young faces. Ethan's friends, Amber's, bridesmaids, people I barely knew. They looked at her the way people look at sunlight, dazzled and unblinking. No one seemed to notice the barb tucked beneath her words, but I did, and I think she wanted me to. Ethan leaned toward me as the laughter continued. "She didn't mean it like that, Mom," he whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Dinner went on a long parade of fancy dishes I couldn't pronounce and didn't want to. Amber floated from guest to guest, her laughter following her like perfume. Every so often she'd touch Ethan's arm, lean close, whisper something that made him smile. Watching them, I felt both proud and strangely far away, as though I were looking at my son through glass. When dessert came, she stood and tapped her spoon against her glass. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said, glowing under the light. "And I especially want to thank Margaret for her generosity and kindness. None of this would be possible without her." Applause followed, and I felt my cheeks warm. Her words sounded gracious, but something about the way she said kindness made it sound almost quaint, like a relic. She turned toward me, her smile wide. "You've raised such a wonderful son," she said. "Ethan's heart is so big, I guess that must be where he gets it from." The room laughed softly. I smiled again, knotting my throat tight. It was praise wrapped like a gift, but inside it was empty. After her toast, people started mingling again. I stepped outside for air, leaning against the balcony railing, overlooking the city. The night was warm, the sky low and heavy with clouds. I could hear the hum of conversation behind me, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the sound of Amber's voice rising above the rest. I tried to remind myself that it was almost over, just one more day, and then the wedding, and then maybe peace. When I walked back inside, I caught sight of her standing in the corner near the entrance, her back half turned to the crowd. She was holding her phone close, whispering something I couldn't hear. The screen glowed against her face, painting it in pale light. "Camera angle ready for tomorrow," she said quietly, then smiled to herself. I froze for a moment, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. Then someone called her name, and she turned her expression instantly soft and bright again. "Margaret," she said, slipping her phone into her clutch. "There you are. We were just talking about how beautiful the roses are in your garden. You'll have to tell me your secret." Her tone was warm, almost friendly, but I felt the chill under it. I forced a smile. "Patience," I said, "and pruning." She laughed, looping her arm through Ethan's as if nothing had happened. "See, always something to learn from you." The rest of the evening blurred together the speeches, the laughter, the flicker of candles on silver plates. I smiled when I was supposed to clap when others did spoke when spoken to. On the surface, it looked like harmony, but underneath, something was shifting. I could feel it, like the subtle tightening of a string before it snaps. As I watched Amber pose for photos, her perfect smile framed by friends and wine glasses, I realized I had underestimated her. I thought her vanity was her weakness, but vanity I was beginning to see could be a weapon too. I didn't see the trap, but she was already tightening it. The morning of the wedding felt like a scene from a dream, too perfect, too polished. The kind of perfection that makes you wonder what's waiting underneath. The sun was warm, the sky impossibly blue. The garden venue was everything Amber had wanted, an elegant canopy of white roses, gold-trimmed chairs, and a string quartet playing softly as guests arrived in pastel dresses and tailored suits. It should have been beautiful. It was beautiful. But standing there, I couldn't shake the sense that the air itself was holding its breath. I had spent the early hours helping the coordinator arrange the seating cards and checking last-minute details. It wasn't my job, but old habits die hard. When everything looked right, I went to my seat at the front row, the one marked Mother of the Groom. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Ethan looked so handsome standing at the altar, his smile nervous and proud. My heart swelled, seeing him, my little boy, who used to run barefoot through our backyard, now a man about to start his life. Then the music changed and every head turned. Amber appeared at the end of the aisle, framed by the archway, like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her gown shimmered with tiny pearls that caught the sunlight, her smile radiant, practiced perfect. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I wanted to feel joy for her for them, but something about her eyes stopped me. Even from that distance, they looked cold, calculating. The ceremony itself went smoothly. The vows were memorized, the laughter light, the tears real enough to convince everyone watching. I held my bouquet tightly through the whole thing, focusing on breathing evenly, ignoring the faint sense that I was an extra in someone else's play. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause. Amber turned her head slightly toward the camera crew, making sure her profile caught the light just right. After the ceremony, guests moved to the reception tent, a lavish space draped in silk with chandeliers that glittered like captured stars. Every table was lined with gold cutlery and tall crystal flutes. I could almost see my reflection in the polished surfaces, though I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, out of place. Amber floated through the crowd like a hostess at a royal ball, shaking hands, laughing, making sure every camera followed her. She had a talent for controlling a room. Each gesture measured each word, landing softly but perfectly. She called everyone darling. She touched arms lightly, smiled constantly. To anyone watching, she was grace incarnate. Dinner passed in a blur of speeches and clinking glasses. Ethan thanked everyone, his voice cracking when he mentioned his father. I smiled through tears. For a fleeting moment, I believed maybe everything would be all right that this day, despite everything, could be remembered for love and not tension. Then came the toasts. Amber stood champagne flute in hand, her veil now pinned back, her hair glowing in the light. I just want to say how thankful I am, she began, her voice syrup smooth. To my friends, my family, and to my wonderful new mother-in-law who made all of this possible, she turned toward me, eyes glistening. Margaret, you are truly the heart of this day. A murmur of admiration swept through the guests. I smiled, modest and grateful, lifting my glass slightly. Amber stepped closer, her movements graceful as ever, and said, "To family and to love that lasts forever." She lifted her glass higher, and as she turned, the liquid in her flute arced through the air, landing squarely on my head. Cold champagne ran down my hair, my face soaking the front of my dress. The sound of the room changed instantly, a few gasps, then laughter. Amber covered her mouth in feigned horror. "Oh, I didn't see you there," she exclaimed, her tone light, playful. "I'm so clumsy." Her friend beside her giggled and whispered, "I got it." I caught the words as clearly as if they'd been shouted. Amber's eyes flicked toward the camera crew, then back to me, just long enough for a tiny, satisfied smirk to flicker before disappearing. Ethan froze his expression, torn between shock and confusion. "Amber," he said, stepping forward. "What are you?" But she cut him off with a laugh. "It's fine. Really, it's just a little spill." She dabbed at my shoulder with a napkin, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry. You're taking it so well around us." The guests began laughing again, the tension breaking. Someone clapped. Someone else took a picture. The sound of cameras clicking filled the space like insects buzzing. I sat perfectly still, letting her pat my shoulder as the champagne dripped from my hair onto the floor. My hands were trembling, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me shake. Inside, something heavy broke loose, an old piece of trust, maybe. I looked at her, this woman I had welcomed into my family, and saw her for what she was. Not a bride, not a victim of nerves or clumsiness, but a performer who had just nailed her scene. Ethan tried to speak again, but the music started up before he could. Someone ushered the guests toward the dance floor. Amber turned back to the crowd, already laughing, already glowing again under the lights. It was as if nothing had happened. I stood slowly brushing off my dress. My face burned, but my voice was steady when I whispered to Ethan, "Enjoy your evening, sweetheart." Then I walked out of that tent, each step slow and measured, past the tables, past the murmuring guests, past the cameras still flashing. I could feel their eyes following me, could hear the whispers starting behind me, soft but sharp. Outside, the air was cool, the night still. The laughter from inside echoed faintly as I stood beneath the dark sky. I closed my eyes, letting the champagne drip into the grass, breathing in the faint scent of roses from the garden beyond. I walked out drenched, not in champagne, but in shame. By the time I reached my car, the night air had turned cold. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking, watching the lights of the reception tent flicker in the rearview mirror. The laughter inside carried faintly through the open window, a sound that once would have made me smile, now cutting through me like glass. I drove home slowly, careful and silent, my dress clinging to my skin. I didn't even turn on the radio. I just needed the quiet, though it pressed against me like a weight. When I walked into the house, the stillness was almost cruel. The roses Robert had planted were visible through the kitchen window, pale in the moonlight, nodding gently in the breeze. I stood there for a long time staring at them, wondering what he would have said if he'd been alive to see what our son had just allowed to happen. I didn't cry that night. The tears sat somewhere behind my ribs, but they wouldn't come. I think humiliation dries a person out before grief can reach them. The next morning, the world already knew. I made the mistake of opening my phone. The wedding photos were everywhere. Amber's friends had posted them, tagged them, shared them. The captions were all the same, the perfect day. There she was, glowing in white, her head thrown back in laughter, champagne in hand. And there was Ethan smiling beside her, love shining from his face. I kept scrolling, searching for a glimpse of myself, the mother of the groom, the woman who'd paid for every inch of that glittering scene. There was one picture of me, but I'd been cropped out halfway. Just my hand remained holding a glass champagne spilling midair. In the next shot, Amber was laughing, hand over her mouth, looking radiant. The comments were full of heart emojis and congratulations. "You look like royalty. Best wedding ever." I turned off the phone and set it face down on the counter. The quiet came rushing back, thick and heavy. I could almost hear Robert's voice in my mind, calm, steady, protective. "You don't need to prove anything to them, Maggie," he would have said. But I did feel the need. I needed anyone to see that I hadn't done anything wrong. Around noon, Ethan texted just one line. "She didn't mean it, Mom." I read it 3 times. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "Are you okay?" Just that. She didn't mean it. I could almost hear his tone, tired, embarrassed, pleading for me not to make things harder. I typed out a dozen replies and deleted them all. Anything I said would sound bitter, and bitterness was exactly what Amber wanted from me. So I put the phone away. That afternoon, I noticed the champagne-stained photo frame on the mantel, the one from Ethan's graduation with Robert, standing proudly beside him, my hand resting on both their shoulders. The glass was spotted from where I'd set it near the roses during the wedding preparations. I took it down, filled the sink, and began to wash it carefully, one corner at a time. The soap made small rainbows in the water. When I dried the frame, I looked at Robert's face. The steadiness in his eyes, the quiet pride it undid me in a way the champagne never could. I whispered to him, my voice barely audible. I thought I raised him better. The words cracked halfway through, but saying them out loud felt necessary, like setting a truth down where it could finally rest. The house creaked as the afternoon sun faded. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. Every movement felt slower, like my body was resisting time itself. I didn't turn on the television, didn't play music, didn't call anyone. I just sat in the kitchen tracing the rim of the mug with my finger, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint rustle of the garden outside. At one point, I caught my reflection in the window, my hair still dull from where the champagne had dried, my eyes tired but dry. For a second, I almost didn't recognize myself. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was something quieter, deeper, the ache of being unseen, unheard, unimportant in the story you helped build. Evening came, and with it, shadows. The house filled with that particular kind of silence that only visits when something important has broken. I thought of Ethan and Amber somewhere across town, surrounded by laughter, their phones lighting up with comments and hearts. I imagined him looking at her the way he used to look at me when he was small, as if I were the safest person in the world. The thought made my chest tighten. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. The ceiling above me glowed faintly with streetlight, and I lay there listening to the sound of my own breathing. I wondered when the shift had happened, the moment my son stopped seeing me as his anchor and started seeing me as an obligation. Maybe it had been coming for years. Maybe Amber had only lit a fire that was already waiting to burn. The house was utterly still. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between seconds. I closed my eyes, pressing the pillow against my chest, as if I could muffle the weight inside me. That night, silence hurt more than any word. In the days that followed, the silence didn't lift, it settled. It moved into the house like an unwanted guest, filling every room, echoing in every empty space. Ethan didn't call again. Amber didn't either. The only sound most mornings was the faint creak of the floorboards and the kettle whistling for tea I rarely finished. I tried to move on the way. People always tell you to keep busy. Take walks, tidy up. One afternoon, the attic caught my eye. It had been years since I'd gone up there, not since Robert passed. The pull cord hung from the ceiling like an invitation. I climbed the stairs slowly, coughing a little at the dust that rose to meet me. The air smelled of old wood, cardboard, and time. Boxes lined the walls labeled in Robert's handwriting. Bills, 1995 to 2000. Family photos, Robert's work. His handwriting was steady, all block letters, just as I remembered it. I opened the box marked work and found a mess of papers, contracts, ledgers, yellowed letters with company logos I didn't recognize. He had always been meticulous about his work. The man believed in record-keeping the way priests believe in prayer. Near the bottom of the box, tucked between two old folders, was an envelope. My name was written across it in his handwriting, familiar, certain, and somehow still alive after all this time. I froze. My fingers trembled as I lifted it. The paper was brittle, faintly discolored along the edges. I sat on the attic floor, legs crossed like a child, and opened it carefully. Inside was a single page folded once. I recognized the stationery immediately cream-colored, embossed with the faint outline of the company logo where he had worked. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. My dearest Margaret, if you ever find this letter, it means time has caught up to us in the way it always does. I've spent my life trying to be fair and honest, even when the world wasn't. If life ever shames you, let your truth be your crown. Wear it high and don't bow to anyone who mistakes your kindness for weakness. With all my love, Robert. I read it 3 times before folding it back into the envelope. My chest felt full of grief, of longing of something new I couldn't quite name. His words didn't erase the hurt, but they shifted something inside me. The shame I'd been carrying like a weight began to feel less like a punishment and more like a test. If life ever shames you, let your truth be your crown. I whispered it aloud, testing the sound of it. It was the kind of thing only Robert would write, simple, strong, unshakable. That evening I made tea and sat by the window holding the letter on my lap. Outside, the roses bent gently in the breeze, the same ones he had planted decades ago. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. The quiet didn't hurt as much when I imagined him in it. A few days later, I went into town for groceries. It was there in the small produce aisle of Parker's Market that I ran into Tom Bishop, a man who'd worked with Robert years ago. He was older now, thinner, but his handshake was as firm as ever. "Margaret," he said, smiling warmly, "I was just thinking about Robert the other day. You know, that man could spot dishonesty a mile away." I smiled at that. He always said honesty wasn't just a virtue, it was policy. Tom chuckled. "Exactly. You know, we had a bit of trouble near the end. Some young analyst thought she was clever, moving money where it didn't belong. He caught her before it got too far." Something about his tone made me pause. "An analyst?" I asked, pretending to rearrange the apples in my basket. "Yeah," he said, scratching his head. "What was her name? Anna?" "No, that's not it." "Amber." "That's it. Amber Collins. Smart girl, but too ambitious for her own good. She was let go before things got serious. The name hit me like a door slamming in my mind. Amber Collins. My daughter-in-law's maiden name. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Amber Collins," I repeated. He nodded, not noticing the tremor in my voice. "Haven't heard of her since. Robert wasn't happy about it, said she had potential if she'd been honest. He hated seeing waste like that." I smiled faintly, thanking him, and we parted ways. I stood in the parking lot for a long time, the sun sharp against my eyes, the letter from Robert replaying in my head. If life ever shames you, let your truth be your crown. The words no longer felt abstract. They felt like direction. I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind push through the silence that had been suffocating me for weeks. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and searched Amber Collins. The screen filled with Hit's old employee directory's brief mentions in company memos. I clicked through each one, feeling my heart beat faster with every name, every timestamp, every hint of her past life. There she was, the same sharp eyes, the same poised smile, but different hair, a different job title. She had vanished from that world not long after Robert's company let her go. She had reinvented herself. Suddenly, all the little moments, the flattery, the manipulation, the champagne took on new meaning. It wasn't just cruelty. It was deliberate, personal. Her silence suddenly felt deliberate. That realization sat with me all night, heavy and unshakable. I didn't sleep. Instead, I lay awake listening to the clock tick in the hallway, each sound sharp enough to mark the passing of my doubt into something harder, something closer to resolve. Amber's silence wasn't guiltless, it was strategy. She had known exactly what she was doing from the start. And I finally understood that the only way to find peace again was to uncover the truth she had buried. The next morning, I went back up to the attic. The air was still thick with dust, but the unease I'd felt last time had shifted into purpose. I opened the same box of Robert's company files and began pulling folders out one by one, scanning through each label. He'd been meticulous in his record-keeping, a habit I used to tease him about. I never thought I'd be grateful for it now. Most of the papers were financial summaries, project reports, client memos. Then I found a smaller file tucked between two thick binders, its tab marked simply Personnel. Inside were performance reviews, internal reports, handwritten notes in Robert's steady block letters. I sifted through the stack until a name caught my eye. Amber Collins. My stomach tightened. I flattened the page on the floor and began to read. The report was brief, clinical, dated 7 years ago. Termination due to fraudulent accounting entries and unauthorized fund movement between accounts. At the bottom, under Robert's signature, was a handwritten note in blue ink, sharp mind. No honesty. My breath caught. The attic seemed to tilt around me. I whispered the words aloud, almost afraid of hearing them. Sharp mind. No honesty. That was her. Every smile, every compliment, every carefully placed word, they weren't just manipulations. They were the habits of someone who'd learned to disguise deceit as charm. She hadn't stumbled into my family by chance. She'd chosen it. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. The weight of what I was seeing was too large to fit into one thought. Robert had fired her. She had been part of his firm. She had known who we were long before Ethan met her. But how I went downstairs, my heart pounding, and poured myself a glass of water, I didn't drink. The pieces were starting to fit together, but I needed proof, something beyond an old report. I opened my laptop, typed Amber Collins again, and compared the corporate photo I'd found earlier to the wedding pictures still floating across social media. Even with the change in hairstyle and name, there was no mistaking her. The shape of her eyes, the sharpness of her chin, it was the same woman. I leaned back, gripping the edge of the table. Robert had uncovered her dishonesty once, and now, years later, she had come back to punish the only thing left of him, his family. My humiliation at the wedding wasn't just cruelty. It was vengeance. I picked up the phone and stared at it. There were 2 numbers in my mind, Ethan's, and one belonging to Robert's old associate, a man named Peter Lawson. Calling Ethan now would only make him defensive. He was still under her spell. But Peter, he might remember more. I found his number in an old address book and dialed before I could talk myself out of it. "Margaret Hall," he said after a moment, his voice cautious but kind. "Well, it's been a long time. How are you?" "I'm fine, Peter," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "I need your help with something. It's about an old employee at Robert's firm, a woman named Amber Collins." There was a pause. "Collins," he repeated. "Yes, I remember her. Caused quite a storm. Why do you ask?" "I think she's someone my son married," I said quietly. "At least she used to be. She's changed her name since then. Can you cross-check her employment under both names?" Peter didn't answer right away. I could hear the shuffle of papers on his end, the click of a keyboard. "That's unusual, Margaret. But yes, I can try. Give me the second name." "Amber Hall." He let out a low whistle. Your daughter-in-law. Yes, I said. I need to know if I'm right about her. He sighed softly. If she's who I think she is, you don't just have a problem, Margaret, you have a dangerous one. But let me confirm before we jump to conclusions. I'll call you back when I find something. After we hung up, I sat still listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a storm was moving in. I could feel it through the walls, the soft rattle of wind against the windows. I folded Robert's letter in my lap, again reading the words until they blurred. If life ever shames you, let your truth be your crown. He had written that before Amber ever entered our lives, before he knew the shape her revenge would take. It felt as if he had left me instructions long before I needed them. The shame she tried to drown me in wasn't meant for me. It had started with him. For the first time since the wedding, my fear began to fade. In its place, something steadier was taking root. An understanding that what had happened wasn't random, and that the pain I'd felt had a name, a history, and now a purpose. My humiliation wasn't random, it was inherited. That thought stayed with me for days, circling in my mind like a quiet storm. It didn't make the pain vanish, but it changed its shape. Knowing that Amber's cruelty had roots that it began long before she ever met me, turned my sorrow into something else. It became focus, resolve. I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like a keeper of evidence. The truth wasn't just a defense anymore. It was a weapon, and I had learned finally how to hold it. Peter Lawson called me 2 days later. His voice was tense but calm. Margaret, he said, I've checked the records. You were right. Amber Collins worked under a temporary ID for Robert's firm about 7 years ago. After her termination, she filed a legal name change in another state, Halloran, then simply Hall. She covered her trail well, but not perfectly. I thanked him and sat in silence after hanging up. My heart was steady, my mind clear. I had confirmation. Now I needed understanding. Why had she come back? Why Ethan? What did she hope to destroy? The only other name connected to her past was listed on an old HR file, an emergency contact, Frank Collins, father. I didn't know if he was still alive, but I had a starting point. I spent that night searching public records until I found him. Frank J. Collins, age 70, living 2 towns over in a small place near the old railroad line. The next morning, I printed the address and drove there before I could second-guess myself. The neighborhood was quiet, worn at the edges. Yards untrimmed, paint peeling. I parked in front of a narrow house with a rusted mailbox that read Collins in fading letters. I stood there for a long time before knocking, unsure what I would say. The door opened after the second knock. A frail man stood there, his eyes pale and tired, but alert. He leaned on a cane and looked me over without speaking. Mr. Collins, I asked softly. My name is Margaret Hall. I believe you're Amber's father. He sighed, a sound more weary than surprised. You're the mother of the man she married, he said after a moment. I saw the photos. She made sure everyone did. I just need to understand, I said. Why she's doing this. He stepped aside and motioned me in. The house smelled faintly of dust and medicine, but it was clean, neat in a way that felt deliberate. We sat in the small living room, the afternoon light slanting through yellow curtains. A kettle hissed faintly on the stove. He didn't look at me right away. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. She ruins everything she touches, he said. She always has. When her mother died, something in her hardened. She started lying about everything, school jobs, money. She could charm anyone until they saw what was underneath. I listened, hands folded in my lap. Robert, my husband, fired her years ago, I said slowly. She was caught moving money. I think that's when this started. He nodded, once his jaw tightening. She told me about that. Said a man named Robert Hall destroyed her career. I didn't realize she'd gone looking for his family. His eyes found mine, then sharp, and filled with something between guilt and sorrow. You can't save your son, Mrs. Hall. Only the truth can. He rose unsteadily and crossed the room to a small desk. From a drawer, he pulled a thick envelope held together with a rubber band. I kept these, he said, placing it in my hands, for the day someone might need them. Inside were documents, Amber's old ID, with her original name, a notarized certificate of name change, and photocopies of financial reports from Robert's firm that matched the ones I'd found in the attic. Proof. Hard, undeniable proof. I looked up at him, my throat tight. Why give this to me? He sank back into his chair, eyes distant. Because I couldn't stop her, he said. I tried. When she started lying to me, taking from me, I let her go. But I see now I just let her destroy more people. Maybe this way I can at least make it right. We sat in silence for a moment, two old souls carrying the weight of the same young woman's choices. Then he extended his hand. It trembled slightly, but the grip was firm. For them, he said quietly. I squeezed his hand. For them, I echoed. The drive home was long and gray, the kind of afternoon where clouds move slowly and time seems to hold its breath. I kept the envelope beside me on the passenger seat, glancing at it every so often, like it was a living thing. In a way, it was the beating heart of the truth Robert had always believed would come out. When I reached home, I set the documents on the kitchen table next to Robert's letter. Two sets of handwriting, his steady, hers erratic, faced each other like witnesses in a trial yet to begin. I felt no rush to act, no impulse to call Ethan or confront Amber. For the first time, I understood that some things ripen best in silence. Justice, I realized, isn't loud, it's patient. But patience, I learned, can only stretch so far before it begins to ache. I waited 2 days before calling Ethan. My voice was calm when I asked if he could come by for dinner. Just the two of us, I said. I made your favorite. He hesitated. I could hear it in the silence that followed, but eventually he said yes. There was still love between us, thin-strained but still there. I had to believe that love was enough to make him listen. That afternoon, I set the table carefully, just as I used to when Robert came home from long workdays. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house, the same recipe Ethan always asked for as a child. The documents, the ones Frank Collins had given me, were tucked neatly in a folder on the sideboard next to Robert's letter. It wasn't anger that guided me anymore. It was clarity. Ethan arrived right on time. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, and when he hugged me, it was quick, polite. Amber wanted to come, he said, but she's feeling a bit under the weather. I think it's better this way, I said, pouring him a glass of iced tea. We ate quietly for a while. The conversation stayed safe, worked the new house, his plans for the holidays. But the air between us carried something heavier unsaid, but felt. When he set his fork down and looked at me, I knew he could feel it too. Mom, he said, his voice cautious. If this is about the wedding— It's not, I interrupted gently. It's about Amber. His expression shifted defensive before I'd even begun. What about her? I rose from the table and retrieved the folder. My hands didn't shake this time. I opened it slowly, sliding the documents toward him. Her old ID, the name change certificate, the copies of financial reports marked with her signature. I think there's something you need to know. He frowned, glancing at the pages without really seeing them. What is this evidence? I said quietly. Your wife isn't who she says she is. She worked for your father years ago. He fired her for fraud. She changed her name afterward, started over, and she married you because of that connection. This wasn't coincidence, Ethan. It was revenge." For a long moment, he said nothing. The clock ticked in the background. The air conditioner hummed softly. Then he let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Mom, come on. This is insane. Amber was 10 years younger than Dad when he died. How could she even—" "She was 21 when she worked for him," I said. "She's 30 now. It fits." He pushed the papers back toward me. "You've been digging through Dad's old things again, haven't you? You always do this. You find ghosts in everything." "Ethan." "No, Mom." His voice rose. "You're judging her the way people used to judge you. Do you remember that? After Dad died. How people whispered about you moving on too soon, about how you handled money, how you lived alone. You hated it. You hated being misunderstood. And now you're doing the same thing to her." The words hit harder than I expected. I saw the boy he used to be in that anger, the one who defended his friends on the playground, who couldn't stand to see someone accused unfairly. But this time, he was defending the wrong person. "I'm not judging her," I said softly. "I'm showing you what's true. Please, Ethan, just look again. These aren't rumors. They're facts." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping the floor. "I can't do this, Mom. Amber's not perfect, but she's my wife. You have to stop trying to control everything. Control." The word stung. "Is that what you think this is?" I asked. "Control. I lost that a long time ago. I'm just trying to protect you." He shook his head, his eyes full of a tired sadness that made him look older than his years. "You can't protect me from who I love," he said quietly. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "I need some air," he said. "We'll talk later." When the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale. The clinking of the clock returned louder now. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, the half-eaten dinner, the papers still spread across the table like forgotten prayers. Finally, I stood and began to clear the dishes. The motions were slow, automatic. I scraped the plates, wiped the counter, and rinsed the glasses. As I reached for the vase at the center of the table, one of the roses Robert had grown years ago lost a petal. It drifted down, landing softly on the linen cloth. I watched it for a long time, the delicate curve of red against white. It looked too gentle to mean anything, and yet somehow it did. I gathered the folder and Robert's letter, placing them side by side again on the counter. If Ethan couldn't believe me, I would find another way. Maybe Robert's lesson had been meant for more than just me. If he couldn't see the truth, I'd make the world see it instead. That decision changed the way the air felt in my house. The heaviness that had followed me since the wedding lifted, replaced by something steadier. Not anger, not vengeance, but focus. I moved through the next morning as if guided by Robert's hand, doing what needed to be done without hesitation. My son might have chosen blindness, but I would give him sight whether he wanted it or not. The anniversary party was only a week away. Amber had planned it herself, of course, lavish, public, and carefully curated. The same event planner she'd hired for the wedding was running it again, a young woman named Emily, who had always been polite to me, though cautious around Amber. I still had her number saved. I called her that afternoon. "Emily, this is Margaret Hall," I said. "I wanted to ask a small favor. During the anniversary party, I'd like to play a short video for my son, a surprise, something sentimental." "Nothing dramatic." There was a pause. "A video." "Of course, Mrs. Hall. I can arrange that. Will it need sound and projection?" "Yes," I said. "Full sound. It's important he hears every word." She agreed, promising to have everything ready. I thanked her, my tone light calm. When I hung up, I felt my pulse slow. One piece of the plan was set. The next step was harder. I called Frank Collins, Amber's father. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but when I told him what I needed, he didn't hesitate. "You want me to record a statement," he said. "Confirm the papers, the fraud, the name change." "Yes," I said softly. "It's time people hear the truth. From someone other than me." He exhaled, the sound rough with regret. "You're doing what I should have done a long time ago." She's always been good at hiding behind charm, but she can't charm her way out of facts. We spent an hour on the phone. I walked him through what to say, careful to make sure every word was clear and honest. When the video arrived the next day, sent from his neighbor's phone, it was perfect. He sat in his small living room, the afternoon sun spilling across his face. His voice was steady as he said, "My daughter, born Amber Collins, later changed her name to Amber Hall. The documents you will see are real. The fraud charges were real. She blames the Hall family for what happened, but she did this to herself. I'm speaking now because I don't want more good people hurt by her lies." I watched it twice, then again until I could recite the words myself. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But peace never lasts long when lies start to unravel. 2 days later, I got a call from Peter Lawson, the man from Robert's old firm. His voice was tense. "Margaret," he said, "I don't know how she found out, but someone's been in the archives. Digital files, backups, even the off-site storage. They've been erased. Everything connected to the Collins fraud case is gone." A chill ran through me, though I kept my tone even. When last night he said, "It's like she knew we'd been talking. Whoever did it had the right credentials or copies of them. This wasn't random." "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "You've done enough. Leave the rest to me." After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, the weight of it sinking in. Amber was moving fast now. She must have felt the shift, the tightening of the same net she had once cast over me. I imagined her pacing in that modern kitchen of hers, phone in hand, issuing commands in her perfectly even tone. She was covering her tracks the same way she had years ago. Only this time, she didn't know the ground had already changed beneath her. I opened my desk drawer and took out the folder, the original reports, the copies Frank had given me and Robert's letter. I'd made a backup of everything the day I found them. The USB drive sat safely inside the frame of our wedding photo. The picture itself. Robert and me on the church steps, his hand resting on mine, looked innocent enough. No one would ever guess that behind that photo lay the proof of everything she'd done. I slid the frame open, checked that the small drive was still nestled inside, and closed it again. I placed it back on the mantel right where it had always stood. The house felt still again, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. That evening, I received one more text from Ethan. Just 4 words, "Please don't do this." No explanation, no call. He knew something, or maybe she had told him what she suspected. Either way, I didn't reply. Some truths can't be explained, they have to be witnessed. The day of the anniversary party was set. I looked at the calendar and drew a small red circle around it, a quiet promise to myself and to Robert that this time I wouldn't be silent. She erased the files, not knowing I'd already printed the truth. The night of the anniversary arrived like a storm disguised in silk. From the moment I stepped into the ballroom, I could feel the hum of money and performance. The chandeliers dripped light like melted gold. The guests shimmered in sequins and champagne, and at the center of it all stood Amber, radiant, composed, and poisonous. A year had passed since the wedding, but she looked untouched by time, as if cruelty itself had preserved her. Ethan stood beside her, smiling dutifully. I could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. The crowd buzzed with compliments. "You two are perfect," someone said. "The picture of love." Amber, soaked it in her laughter, rehearsed every glance calculated. I stayed near the edge of the room, holding my own glass of champagne, a quiet observer. I had worn dark blue, Robert's favorite color. It made me feel grounded and visible in the best way. The speeches began. Amber took the microphone, voice smooth as glass. "1 year ago today, I married the love of my life," she said. "And tonight, we have something even more beautiful to share." The lights dimmed slightly. She reached for Ethan's hand, pressing it dramatically against her stomach. "We're expecting a baby!" The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, laughter. Champagne glasses lifted, camera flashes flared. I stood still, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. Across the room, Emily, the event planner, caught my eye. She gave a small nod. Everything was ready. Amber was still glowing in the spotlight when I began to walk forward. My shoes clicked softly against the marble, the sound cutting through the chatter. She noticed me just as I reached the center of the room. For a moment, her smile wavered, a small crack in the porcelain. I lifted my glass. "A year ago," I said clearly, my voice carrying through the room, "you poured this on me." A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests. I paused, the silence expanding between us. Then I lowered the glass slightly. "Tonight I return it not with a drink, but with the truth." The room stilled. Ethan blinked, confused. Amber's face froze in a mask of poise. Emily gave the cue. The lights dimmed, and the projection screen behind the couple flickered to life. At first, there was only text, a company logo, a date, then scanned documents. The first image was an employment record, Amber Collins, Junior Analyst, Hall Financial Group. The next line, termination reason, fraudulent activity, and unauthorized fund transfers. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Amber laughed lightly, too loud. "Margaret, what is this?" she said, voice strained. "Some kind of—" But her words stopped when the video continued. A younger Amber appeared in a company photo, unmistakable even with darker hair. Then came Robert's handwritten note, projected large enough for everyone to read, sharp mind. "No honesty." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Ethan's head turned toward her, slowly disbelief washing over his face. Amber stepped forward, her tone desperate now. "This is insane. These are fake." The screen changed again. Metadata logs appeared beside ultrasound images, lines of digital timestamps. A voiceover, calm neutral, began explaining. "Files verified as digitally altered. Original data shows the source was a stock medical image." The crowd gasped. Amber froze, her composure finally slipping. "Stop this," she hissed. "Turn it off." Then Frank Collins appeared on screen. The old man's voice filled the room, trembling but strong. "My daughter, born Amber Collins, changed her name after she was fired for fraud. The documents you're seeing are real. She blames the Hall family for her downfall, but the truth is, she made her own choices. I'm speaking now because she's hurt enough people already." The sound of his voice broke whatever illusion she had left. Amber lunged toward the projector table, shouting, "Turn it off! Give me that USB." She fumbled for the laptop, her hand trembling, but Emily stepped in, blocking her path. Cameras flashed as guests rose, stunned, recording everything. Ethan reached out, his voice hoarse. "Amber, is this true?" She turned on him, her face wild, the perfect mask gone. "You don't understand. They ruined me first. Your father. He ruined me." The words hung in the air like smoke. I stood where I was watching, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The truth didn't need my defense anymore. It was speaking for itself. Security approached quietly, unsure what to do. Amber stumbled backward, her hand still clutching the edge of the projector. She looked around, searching for a face that might still believe her, but none did. Not even Ethan. And then, mercifully, Emily pressed a button and the screen faded to black. The lights rose slowly. The room was silent. People stared at me, then at Ethan, then at the space where Amber had stood. The noise that filled every party she had ever hosted was gone. The quiet wasn't cold or cruel. It was clean, final. I set my glass down on the nearest table. Across the room, Amber stood frozen, her reflection caught in the dark screen behind her, small, distorted, and alone. The screen went dark, and for the first time, silence belonged to me. For several long seconds, no one moved. The air inside the ballroom was heavy, as if the truth itself had weight. Then a single glass shattered somewhere in the back, breaking the spell. Murmurs swelled, overlapping questions and half-whispered gasps. Cameras were still raised, recording the wreckage of a perfect lie. Amber stood frozen in the middle of the room, her face pale under the harsh lights, her hands trembling as if the ground beneath her had vanished. She turned toward me slowly, her expression twisting from shock to rage. "You set me up!" she screamed, her voice raw, echoing through the room. "You planned this from the start." Every eye swung between us, between the woman who had spent a year performing perfection and the one who had finally pulled back the curtain. I didn't move. I didn't need to. My silence had become louder than her voice. Then from the doorway, another sound, the slow, uneven steps of an old man. Heads turned as Frank Collins, her father, entered the room. He leaned on his cane, his breathing shallow, but his presence alone cut through the noise. Amber's expression faltered confusion, flickering across her face. "Dad," she whispered, her tone suddenly small, almost childlike. He stopped beside her, his eyes steady but filled with sorrow. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying farther than I expected. "You did that yourself." The room fell still again. Amber took a step back, shaking her head. "You're lying. You're all lying," her voice cracked. "You never cared about me, any of you." Her father's eyes glistened, but his tone stayed calm. "I cared enough to tell the truth when you couldn't." Amber's fury broke like a dam. She pushed past him, knocking over a chair. "You all wanted this," she shouted. "You wanted me to fail. You never saw me." Her voice rose, desperate, as if she could rebuild the walls collapsing around her with noise alone. Ethan took a step forward. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow. "Amber," he said softly, "is it true?" She turned to him, clutching his arm. "Ethan, you have to listen to me." But he pulled away. "You lied to me. About everything. The baby." Her lips parted, but no words came. In that silence, every answer he needed was written across her face. He stared at her for a long moment, then at me. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I don't even know who either of you are anymore." "Ethan?" I started, but he shook his head. "No, Mom. I need to think." His gaze dropped to the floor. "I can't do this right now." He turned and walked toward the exit, the crowd parting for him. I wanted to reach for him, to call out, to explain that all of this, every revelation, every moment of pain, was meant to free him. But my hand stayed at my side. "Let him go," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Some lessons can't be spoken. They have to be lived. Amber stood alone now, surrounded by the remnants of her illusion, toppled chairs, spilled drinks, stares that once adored her, now heavy with disgust. The strength she had wielded so easily, The charm she had worn like armor, all of it slipped away. Her makeup streaked under her eyes, her shoulders shaking. She opened her mouth once, twice, as if searching for another lie to hide behind, but none came. The crowd watched her crumble. Her father stepped closer, his voice gentle but unyielding. "You can stop now, Amber," he said. "It's over." She sank to her knees, sobbing. For a brief moment, the room's anger gave way to something else, pity. Even I felt it. She wasn't the monster she had pretended to be. She was a broken person who had built her life out of revenge, only to find there was nothing left to stand on once the truth returned. The lights flickered as the cleanup began. Guests whispered apologies to me, unsure whether to stay or leave. Some averted their eyes entirely. I thanked them quietly, my words steady, my hands calm. When I looked toward the doorway, I could see Ethan standing outside, beneath the hotel awning, his silhouette framed by rain. He didn't turn back, but I didn't expect him to. Some wounds need solitude before they can begin to close. I stepped out onto the terrace for air. The storm that had threatened all evening had finally broken. Raindrops pattered against the marble, cool against my skin. The city beyond glimmered faintly through the haze. My reflection shimmered in the glass railing, older, stronger, unrecognizable from the woman who had once stood humiliated beneath a champagne spill. Inside, I could still hear the muffled sobs, the faint hum of voices cleaning up what was left of the evening. But out here, the sound softened, replaced by the rhythm of rain and my own breathing. I thought of Robert, of his letter. "If life ever shames you, let your truth be your crown." I finally understood what he meant. Truth isn't soft. It doesn't comfort first. It hurts, strips away, leaves you raw. But then slowly it heals. I tilted my face upward, letting the rain wash over me, tasting salt, and something like peace. Behind me, Amber's cries grew fainter, lost in the distance. Ahead, the horizon began to lighten, thin streaks of dawn breaking through the storm. Truth hurts first, then it heals. And in that moment, I felt both victory and sorrow. Months passed quietly after that night, as if the world itself was exhaling the chaos that had filled it. The story of Amber's downfall rippled briefly through the social circles that once adored her, then faded like a rumor too heavy to sustain. The footage from the anniversary party spread online for a time, but even scandal grows old when people tire of outrage. Eventually, silence took its rightful place again. Ethan moved out of the apartment he had shared with her. He rented a small home near the coast, a modest place where he said he could hear himself think. He called me sometimes short, uncertain conversations that always began with weather and ended with gratitude. There was distance still, but it no longer hurt. He was healing in his own way, and I had learned that love, when patient, could mend things time could not. I filled my days with the small comforts I had neglected: the garden, the weekly book club, the occasional lunch with old friends. I baked again, not out of duty, but for the quiet pleasure of it. And every morning I passed the framed wedding photo on the mantel, the one that held the USB, the silent proof of everything that had happened. It had become a kind of relic now, not of pain, but of what truth costs and what it gives back. Then, one mild afternoon in early spring, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. The sky outside was gray and heavy with rain, the kind that smelled like earth and beginnings. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. Amber stood there. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman who had once dripped in elegance now looked almost fragile. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes plain and a little too loose, her face pale under the soft light. The fire that had once burned in her eyes was gone, replaced by something far quieter. "I'm not here to fight," she said. Her voice had changed. No edge, no sweetness designed to disarm, just weariness. I didn't speak right away. I studied her face, searching for even a trace of the arrogance that once defined it. But all I saw was exhaustion. Whatever armor she'd worn had long since cracked. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. She followed me into the kitchen, the same room where she had once laughed at my candle called my home quaint. The same candle still sat on the counter, half-burned, faintly fragrant. She noticed it, but said nothing. I gestured to a chair. "Sit. I'll make tea." As the kettle began to hum, the house felt smaller somehow, filled not with tension, but with a strange, delicate stillness. Amber sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes darting toward the window and back. She was restless, but not dangerous, just lost. When the tea was ready, I placed a cup in front of her and sat across the table. We didn't speak for a few minutes. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only sound between us. Finally, she broke the silence. "I thought you'd slam the door in my face," she said. "I thought about it," I admitted. She managed a weak smile. "You were right about everything." I didn't answer. I watched her fingers tremble as she wrapped them around the teacup. She looked older, though not by years, by consequence. I lost everything, she continued. The firm pressed charges. I'm on probation. No one will hire me. My father doesn't speak to me. Ethan won't answer my calls. Her voice cracked on his name. You took everything from me. I tilted my head slightly. No, Amber. You gave it away. The words hung between us, and she didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, her chin trembling. Maybe you're right, she whispered. But I came here because I needed to see you, to know if you hate me. I took a slow breath. I don't hate you, I said. I pity you. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't want your pity. Then rebuild yourself, I said softly. That's the only thing left worth doing. She looked down at her tea. I don't know how. You'll learn, I said. But you'll have to do it honestly this time. For a moment, it almost felt like peace. But then her gaze shifted subtle, fleeting, toward the drawer by the counter. The one where the remaining documents were kept. The instinct was still there. Buried, but not dead. Her hand drifted ever so slightly toward it, her expression faintly thoughtful, the way a thief remembers the weight of something once stolen. I watched her fingers graze the handle before she even realized what she was doing. I reached out and rested my hand gently over hers. She froze. You've already taken enough, I said quietly. Go rebuild yourself. Her breath hitched. She stared at me for a moment, then pulled her hand back slowly as if the act itself burned. Her shoulders sagged, the fight gone entirely. I wasn't going to, she began, but the words died in her throat. I know I said, but you thought about it. She looked away, ashamed. A tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a thin trail of mascara. Not the thick, perfect kind she used to wear, but a faint residue of someone still trying to look whole. She stood after a moment, pushing her chair back quietly. I should go, she said. I nodded. You should. She hesitated near the doorway, glancing back at me as though there was something more she wanted to say, but couldn't find the words. I didn't help her. Some things had to remain unfinished. Outside, the rain had started to fall in slow, steady lines. I followed her to the door and opened it for her. She stepped out onto the porch and pulled her coat tighter. "Thank you," she said finally. "It wasn't for the tea. It wasn't even for forgiveness. It was for the chance to leave with some dignity still intact." I watched her walk down the path toward the gate, her footsteps soft against the wet ground. The garden was beginning to bloom again, small buds of pink and red pushing through the damp soil. She stopped once looking at the roses Robert had planted so long ago. Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but she said nothing. When she finally turned the corner and disappeared, I stood in the doorway a little longer, listening to the rain. The air smelled of earth, of endings, and beginnings of something painfully human. For the first time, she looked human and lost. A year has passed since that gray afternoon when Amber stood on my porch and asked for forgiveness she didn't know how to name. Time has a way of softening even the hardest memories, not erasing them, but sanding down their edges until they fit into the story of your life. The world outside my window is different now. The garden has come alive again, the roses blooming in wild, generous colors, as if determined to fill every empty space that sorrow once claimed. The seasons, I've learned, are the truest form of grace. They remind us that nothing, not even pain, is permanent. Ethan visits every Sunday now. He brings groceries, sometimes a pie from the bakery. Always a new story about his work or the stray cat that insists on following him home. We've stopped talking about the past in the way people stop poking a wound that has finally started to heal. But occasionally, when he helps me in the garden, he'll pause, look at the ground, and say something like, "You were right, Mom. She fooled me." And I always answer the same way she fooled us both, son. But we're still here. That's enough. Most days pass quietly. I've learned to enjoy the small sounds, the creak of the porch steps, the clock's steady ticking, the wind whispering through the old oak out back. There's peace in the ordinary when you've lived through chaos. I still keep Robert's letter on my nightstand, its edges soft from handling. Sometimes I read it before bed, the familiar words a comfort. "If life ever shames you, let your truth be your crown." They used to feel like a challenge. Now they feel like a benediction. It was on one of those still mornings in early summer that the letter arrived. The envelope was plain, its corners slightly bent, the return address printed in small, blocky letters that made my breath catch the moment I saw them. Federal Correctional Facility. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down beside my cup of tea. For a long time, I didn't open it. I just looked at it, tracing the shape of my name written in neat, deliberate handwriting I hadn't seen in a year. When I finally unfolded the paper, the words were simple. "Margaret, you were right. I didn't know what love was. I thought it was control. I thought it was being chosen. I thought if I could make someone depend on me, that meant I mattered. I know now it's the opposite. I ruined everything I touched because I didn't understand that love isn't something you take, it's something you give. Tell Ethan I'm sorry. I know he won't believe it yet, but I hope one day he will. I'm learning things here, how to be still, how to listen, how to live with the things I've done. Sometimes I dream about your garden. I think about the smell of that candle and how you didn't throw me out the day I deserved it most. Maybe that was love too, and I was too blind to see it. Thank you for seeing me even when I didn't deserve it. Amber." I sat there for a while, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. There was no self-pity in her words, no performance, no mask, just honesty. And it struck me that maybe this was the truest thing she had ever given anyone. I didn't cry, but something inside me loosened an old knot of anger and grief that I hadn't realized I was still holding. I folded the letter carefully and carried it to the mantel. Robert's photo waited there, his smile forever calm, forever steady. I placed the letter beside it, sliding it under the edge of the frame. "You'd have understood her, wouldn't you?" I said softly. "You always did see the good in broken things." Outside, the sun had begun to stretch across the garden, catching the petals of the roses in soft gold. I walked to the window and opened it, letting the air drift in. The scent of earth and flowers filled the room. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what was lost. I was thinking about what had endured, the people, the lessons, the quiet strength that comes when everything else falls away. Ethan came by that afternoon bringing a bag of fresh bread and a handful of wildflowers. He noticed the new letter on the mantel, but didn't ask. Instead, he poured us both coffee and joined me on the porch. We sat there in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand anything. The breeze lifted the edge of the newspaper on his lap. Birds chirped lazily in the distance. "Do you ever think," he said after a while, "that some people come into our lives just to show us who we don't want to be?" I smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe they come to remind us who we are. He nodded, thoughtful, and after a moment he reached over and took my hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. As the evening settled, I went back inside. The light had softened to amber, the color of endings and beginnings. I picked up the letter again and read it once more, slower this time. There was sorrow in it, yes, but also something that sounded like acceptance, like the first fragile note of redemption. I returned it to its place beside Robert's picture. The glass caught my reflection for an instant, older, lined, but peaceful. I touched the frame gently and whispered to the man who had taught me everything I knew about grace. "Storms don't break us," I said. "They teach us who we are." Outside, the roses swayed in the fading light, their petals glowing softly in the dusk. I stood at the window, watching them, the faint hum of summer insects rising with the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang soft, low, and familiar. And for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. And that was my story. A story about truth, forgiveness, and finding strength long after the storm has passed. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for listening, for sitting with me through every moment, every lesson, every breath it took to finally understand that sometimes life's cruelest chapters can still lead to peace. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment when telling the truth cost you everything but saved your soul? Or a time when forgiveness felt impossible until you saw someone not as your enemy, but simply as human? Share your thoughts and experiences. In the comments, your stories matter just as much as mine. If this story touched you, inspired you, or made you think about your own family, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every story we tell here is a piece of life, sometimes painful, sometimes healing, but always real. By subscribing, you'll help these stories reach more people who might need to hear them. Thank you for spending your time with me. Until the next story, take care of your heart, hold tight to your truth, and remember, storms don't break us, they teach us who we are.